Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Dylan Goldby and welcome to what will be a slightly different format of video from me. Before we do get into that though, I want to wish those who do celebrate it a Merry Christmas, and those who don't, I hope you have a wonderful day anyway. So let's jump into today's topic. Now, one of the things that I like to do at the end of every year is to just sort of look back on, my year in photography. What have I done professionally? What have I done personally? What experiences have I had? What are my favorite images? And what are the takeaways from this year? What are the things that I hope to maybe improve on next year? And usually this comes in the form of a year-end review on my professional blog, or sort of my top 10 or top 20 images on my personal blog. But this year I thought I would do a sort of a 5-image quick review on YouTube here, and just talk you guys through what it is that I was hoping to achieve this year, whether I achieved it, and what I hope to take from that into next year. So while the 5 images that I show here might not be my absolute favorites from this year, these are some of the images that sort of personally have been learning moments, or sort of those aha moments for me, and I wanted to walk you through those in the hope that maybe you can look at your own work and see that, while you might not have achieved exactly what you were hoping for, maybe there are lessons to be learned. And that's definitely what I've come across with this year, because for me this year has been a bit of a different one. Typically I'm able to travel internationally. I will head down with my friends at Pics of Asia and run a workshop in Vietnam. I'll be out traveling to photograph more tattooed faces and hear the stories of the different peoples of Asia. But this year I've been, I guess, stuck at home in a sense. I've been in Korea the entire year, so it's been a very different year photographically for me, and I can't look back on the experiences that I would normally look back on and say, well, I did really well here. It's a very different set of things for me this year, so these images very much represent that. This first image that you see on the screen here is actually a shot of the frozen surface of the Han River here in Seoul. Now, winters here haven't been too cold over the past few years, but this year we actually had a very cold system come down from the Himalayas, and it just gave us sub-zero temperatures for a good week or so, and it froze the surface of the river, which doesn't happen so much anymore. It used to be a lot more common than it is now. And so I really wanted to get out there and just document that in various ways. And so this particular morning I headed out just before the sun rose, and I managed to get sort of the beautiful warm light hitting the buildings, and I was able to get the peaks of the mountains starting to turn a little bit pink as the sun came over the horizon. And it was a really beautiful morning. But what I love most about this image is just the cracks in the ice. You get to sort of follow those around the image, and then you finally end up, or at least I do, continuously sort of resting on the contrast between the warm and the cool at the top of the image there. So there were 3 things that I really wanted to convey here, and those were the freezing cold, the warm light of the sunrise, and the sense that we were actually in a city. This wasn't some sort of landscape out in the countryside that was frozen during winter. And why this image basically made it into my top 5 was that I showed those things without really showing any of them. We have ice to represent the cold, so you can see all the cracks going through there. We have the reflection of the warm light on the buildings to represent the sun. And of course, there's that sort of abstract reflection of those buildings, not the actual buildings themselves, that sort of represents the city and gives you an idea that we're in the city, but doesn't directly show it. And so this sort of abstract approach to image making is something that I've tried to, I guess, incorporate into various different types of work that I do across the year. So this was a really big learning moment for me. So this next image we have on the screen here is one from a short trip that I took down to Danyang with my good friend Roy last year. And we both have a fairly extensive description of sort of what we were doing down there and the different images we were trying to create on our respective YouTube channels. So I will link to those videos below if you're interested. But the reason that I chose this image is because I love just how stark it is, how I guess it has that sort of winter wonderland kind of feeling to it. And as someone who grew up outside of Melbourne in Australia, where our winters are 10 degrees Celsius most of the time. We very rarely get any snow. It's mostly sort of rain and just mud and, dreary skies for about 2 or 3 months of the year. But I always had this idea in my head of what winter would be from the photos that I'd seen around the world. And I always thought it would be this sort of beautiful world where the entire scene in front of you was just pristine and white, and all you could see were these magical little details. And then I moved to a place like Seoul, which is a big city that gets quite a bit of snow, and quickly realized that that really only lasts a few minutes until people start trampling it and cars start driving over it, or it starts melting, and then it just becomes a bit of a mess. And so I've always loved the scenes and the times when we do actually get to see that feeling, feel that wonderland, that sort of stark kind of winter landscape, which we don't really get too much here. So as I mentioned in the video from this trip, what I was actually trying to achieve photographically was to sort of evoke the feeling of inkwash paintings and be able to have that sort of white canvas with just enough details on it to really show you what was going on. And for me, this is one of the photographs from that trip that really gave that feeling. It really achieved my goals for that. So with that in mind, I guess this image really makes it into my top 5, as it started a trend towards, I guess, even simpler images with lower contrast in my work. It made me rethink the way I compose things and just really try and cut out any extraneous details and use, colors or patterns or things like that to basically allow me to take anything out of my images that I didn't want to be in there. Now, I'm constantly swaying back and forth on what I like in terms of contrast. Sometimes I go really high contrast, sometimes I go really low contrast, but I think this image got me really starting to think about that. This next image is one from a trip out to Soraksan National Park when I went out to photograph basically the fringes of a passing typhoon and see how that would sort of interact with the mountain peaks on the east coast here. And I spoke a little bit about this in the video that I made while I was up there, but basically I was trying to have a bit of a vision in mind while still being open to, what might happen. I think this is a really good case of being open to what might happen. So I was actually jumping on the cable car to head up the mountain on my second day while I was out there, and we had sort of 45 minutes to wait while they loaded up the cable car and took people up to the peak, and our turn was coming. So I stood on the rooftop there and I just sort of watched these birds that were sitting on the wires of the cable car, and every time a cable car would go by, a couple of them would get a bit skittish and fly off in various directions. And I thought to myself, well, I've got this beautiful scene here. Wouldn't it be great if? And this is basically the result of that. Like, wouldn't it be great if a single bird flew through my scene? Again here, I was trying to bring that sort of simplicity of an inkwash painting to the composition. If I'd used a polarizer to add contrast to the trees, or maybe bring that sky back a little bit, or cranked up the saturation and brought back the highlights and things like that, I wouldn't really have this feeling. So sort of, exposing for those mountains and just letting everything else fall where it will allowed me to sort of create that feeling again. Now, this image makes it into my top 5 this year, because it was one of those times where, I settled on a composition and just hoped for the best. Now, I might have maybe 20 variations of this image in the end, but this is the one that I wanted from the beginning, and I waited it out and I hoped, and eventually it happened. So oftentimes I'm a bit of a scavenger when I visit new places. I'm trying to capture as much as possible, but with this image I'd really settled on a composition and just waited it out. Now, this is not something completely new to me, this process of honing in on a composition and just waiting, but it's something that I've really been actively trying to force myself to do this year, and this is a good example of that. This next image is of some harsh midday light in the Dongdaemun Design Plaza here in Seoul. Now, as I mentioned in the video that I made while I was out there, this was a chance for me to explore a location that was very close to home in light that I wouldn't normally photograph. So it was sort of trying to take fresh eyes on something you see every day, but also do it in light you wouldn't normally work in. What I love about this image is the stark simplicity of it. Seoul is an extremely busy place where it never really feels like you can find any sort of minimalist or simple compositions, and so this is a really different way of looking at that city for me. And that's the reason that it makes it into my top 5. It basically got me looking at the city in a different way, and it also got me looking at light in a different way. So although there aren't too many locations in Seoul that benefit from this sort of midday harsh light, and there aren't too many times of year when it really works, it has got me looking at the locations that I normally visit in a different way. It's got me looking for ways to use that harsh light. And so for me, that's a really big learning moment from this year. This final image is one that I cycled out to try and get several times. Now, we get this sort of nice fog on the rivers here in the autumn, and this particular scene is a bit of a trophy shot for the local camera clubs. You will see just dozens of people lined up at this time of year trying to get their take on a shot. And while I typically avoid things like that, as I like to try and, I guess, stretch myself a little bit further and try to get something a little bit different, this is something that, after 17 years of living in Korea, I really wanted to go and see for myself and just try and get my own take on. What I love most about this is that we often see telephoto shots of this scene where it's just sort of zoomed in on that island and we see the wisps of fog around there and little trees, maybe a couple of birds flying in, but it's not so common to actually see this man rowing out to check on the boat that he sets up in the river for people to take photos of. So when he entered the scene this morning, it really kind of made the image for me, and I decided to go for a much wider composition where I could take in the surrounding mountains, also take in the fog, but also have him sort of rowing out there. This image makes it into my top 5 as it contains quite a few of my favorite elements. It has the idyllic fog of the Korean autumn. It has not one silhouette, but two. It also has, water, mountains, and warm morning light. But on top of that, it also kind of shows off all the things that I've been really trying to focus on this year with simple compositions and waiting for moments and being open to things that, maybe I didn't go out to photograph, but they happen and I can make an image of them. And it's also really hard for me to pass up that nostalgic feeling of a rowboat in the water when I live in such a technology-fueled metropolis like Seoul. It reminds me to get out there and photograph more of what I love, to visit more of the places that give me a sense of calm and happiness. And these are the things that I really want to incorporate into my images next year. So I hope that it's been interesting for you guys to sort of peer into my brain and sort of see what's been going on outside of the technical aspects of photography over the course of the year. But what I would really love to hear in the comments below is, have you had any sort of learning experiences this year? Has there been a direction that you've noticed in your own photography? Is there something that you really want to add to it next year? I feel like, we concentrate a little bit too much maybe on how an image is technically made and not enough on how it makes us feel or why we made that image. So I hope that we can sort of get that discussion going on in the comments below. And so thank you to everybody who's tuned in this year and allowed me to grow the channel. I really appreciate the time that you give in sitting down and watching the videos that I make, but also in commenting below and continuing the discussions that I present. So I hope that next week you'll tune in for my final video of the year, which is when I'll take a look at the GFX 50S2 and the new kit lens, the 35-70 f 4.5 to 5.6. Again, thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great end to the year.